Hi-Tech synths are easy to make. At least that is something that I claimed in a very old short of mine. Today we'll have a little bit of a deeper look into that claim to see if it is true. So here we are in my Track from Scratch project. For those that remember that series, this is the same project that we worked in that series as well. I've since discontinued that series because people didn't really want to watch it, so I decided to spend my time on things that people actually enjoyed watching. But that means that this project has been a little bit dormant. What I did do recently is change out the kick and bass, so I now have a kick and bass that sounds a little bit better. I'm still not entirely happy with it, but for now it will have to do, because today we're going to be looking at classical high-tech synth sounds. Now there's a few characteristics that we can use to identify these sounds. I've written them down over here. You can see we have a sharp sound, constant random rhythmic movement, random or pseudo-random rhythms. Usually they are very upfront in the mix, there's not a lot of smoothing out that is happening with, for example, reverb and delay. Sometimes they can be very wide in terms of their stereo width, so when you're listening to them on headphones it will sound like they're coming from here and as opposed to coming from directly in the middle of your head. And usually what you'll find is that in the post-processing there's a lot of glitchy effects to help it sit in the track a little bit better. Now with those characteristics in mind, let's start the sound designing process. I'm going to use Faceblend because I like the way that it visualizes different things. So here we have it. As you can see, we have a completely blank slate, so we need to start building up the sound basically from scratch with all of the oscillators. What we know is that we want a very sharp sound, so that is probably going to include some kind of FM setup. So let's already set that up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with an analog. And actually as our modulator, I already know what I want to do because I have some experience with these kind of sounds. So I know that for a modulator, we're going to use a wavetable, and the wavetable that I'm going to use is my SSQ wavetable. For those that don't know, inside of my wavetable spec, you'll find FM modulators over here, and there's a whole bunch of different designer FM modulators that you can choose. But the main one that we're interested in is the SSQ carrier over here, which does a very special type of FM, especially if you set it like this. I've actually done 2 other videos on this technique before, so I'm not going to go too in-depth on how this technique specifically works and how you can make this kind of modulator. But all that we have to do once we have this SSQ carrier wavetable loaded up is to assign it as an FM over here. And you can immediately see what the waveform is actually doing, in that we get these like very strong spikes here, and then the waveform seems to slow down over here. And you can hear that we get a very clicky kind of sound from that. Now I want it to be a little bit more gritty, so the way that I'm going to do that is with a little bit of distortion in here. So we'll add that little bit of distortion right here after that. Let's drive it in there nicely. Now we have something very gritty and very strong. And now we can start to filter it. So let's take our bandpass filter. The reason why I like to do a bandpass filter is because it's also nice and sharp, especially if you boost the resonance like this and maybe make the slope a little bit higher. That's maybe a little bit too much resonance there. And you can already hear that we get that classic high-tech FM kind of sound. Now in this particular case, in terms of the movement of the sounds, the way that the filter is basically going to move throughout the track, what I want to do is I want to have it very unpredictable and not very rhythmical. As we said before, there's kind of 2 characteristics that you can choose. Either you have it completely kind of randomly moving, or there's some kind of pattern to it. In this case, what I think is best is that we have some very unpredictable movements, so I'm going to be using my MIDI controller to play that in. In order to set that up, what we'll do is we'll assign this to a macro here, so this is the filter cutoff. So this way we can modulate it outside here and automate it outside. We should see it show up over here, and if we do it like this, we can also configure it so that it will show up over here. This is useful for later. What we need first though is something that is going to trigger the MIDI, and this is where I want to show another cool trick that I've recently learned. What we'll need is a arpeggio over here. We'll have this velocity over here, this random all preset that I have here. I don't know if this is part of the factory preset, but you can just see the settings and copy those. The main thing that's important here is that it's set to random. And then we want to have another velocity over here, which is going to act like a gate. So we'll set it to gate mode. And then I believe over here, yeah, we can determine the range and we can set it to like halfway over here. And you'll hear that only half of the notes are going to get triggered. Now there's other ways that you can do this. You can use Max for Live devices. I know Altar of Wisdom has a bunch of Max for Live devices that are very useful for this. I know that the Future Phonic guys have a bunch of different Max for Live devices that can also do this. I even believe they have a plugin for this kind of thing if you're not working in Ableton. But I'm not really all too familiar with those. I'd rather use this technique over here because it's completely integrated inside of Ableton. It uses only stock Ableton effects. And it's just very easy and quick to set up. What we'll do now is we'll just make a quick MIDI clip over here. And we're just going to play it in a few spots. I don't want it to continuously kind of play. Even though we have it so that it only plays a certain amount of notes, what I still want to do is just determine where it's going to play. So we'll do maybe something like this, and we'll have it play over here as well. And then we just duplicate this over. Let's see if that works. Let's see if that sounds nice in the context of this track here. I think that works for now. Of course, we're using randomness, so it's always going to be a little bit of a different pattern. At the end, what we'll probably do is record it into MIDI so that we can actually have it deterministically sit inside of the project. And maybe we can edit a little bit more and play around a little bit with the different notes and stuff like that as well. What I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to assign this to my MIDI controller here through the edit MIDI map. And we'll just set it up like that. Make sure that there's no conflict in here, which there isn't. And we can turn on these two knobs over here so that we can actually play it in. And then let's play a little bit with the MIDI controller while this is playing. As you can see, I'm just kind of drawing out the movement for each part that is going to play here. And now we have something that sounds like this. To be honest, I think that the notes are not triggered enough, that there's not enough notes being triggered. So I'm just going to turn this up. This is the nice thing of working like this with it being generatively, in that once this is going to be recorded into MIDI, it is obviously much harder to kind of edit the randomness of it because you already have it as a MIDI file. But now we can still make changes and kind of see where we want to go with this sound, and then we can commit to MIDI later so that we have it always deterministic inside of the project. What I do think is that our movement is a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to up this a little bit here. One thing that we can try is to see what happens when we play it an octave higher. I do like that lower octave a little bit more, but I would like it to be a little bit sharper. So what I'm going to do is just add a bit crusher here. I think what might be cool is to also modulate this bit crusher over here with the same macro. So we'll just up that to maybe like over here. It's a little bit quiet now, so let's add an OTT for the processing. And we'll do something like this over here. Maybe a little bit of saturation just to boost it a little bit in terms of its volume. And then we'll lower its volume over here because it's going to be way too loud now. Now, as we noted in one of the characteristics, there's not a lot of smoothing out that is happening with, for example, delay and reverb. What we can do is add a little bit of that just to make it a little bit more interesting. But what you'll notice with these synths is that I'm going to tone it down much more than you would do on your normal like Psytrance synths. I'm going to use the memory for this one because it's a little bit darker, so it doesn't get in the way of our main sound here. Let's also add a reverb. I'm just going to go with a small room reverb just to put it in the space, but nothing more. At this point, you might say like, this is not the kind of FM that I want to go for. Maybe I want a sine wave as our carrier. Over here, you just get a little bit of a different texture from that. If we want to, we can try to modulate it even more. Maybe let's add another sine wave to it. In terms of the FM, what we'll do is we'll also FM this with a sine wave. Another thing that we can try to make it a little bit more gritty is to actually have the distortion after the filter, so that the distortion actually enhances the kind of resonance that this filter brings. Next up, we need to think about the width. Now, there's a few different ways that we can go about that. First of all, we could just widen it with a stereo widener, something like M stereo spread. So let's load that up. I like to put that right before all of the other processing so that it doesn't really affect the way that the final volume happens over here, because this saturator is just going to clip it. So now you can hear we get this very wide kind of sound. Personally though, I don't like to do it like this with just one plugin doing all of it. I like to kind of combine different techniques to generate a little bit of stereo width. So let's halve this value over here. And let's go back into the patch and actually boost the spread over here a little bit. This is a very interesting way of generating stereo width because the distortion for the left and the right channel is going to be different, as you can see from the graph over here. We get a little bit of a funny sound looking at the graph from that. So maybe let's try toning this one down a little bit more. What we can also try is maybe a little bit of unison. That usually also widens the sound a little bit. Now, one of the things that our sound is missing is a little bit of extra variation. Mainly the way that I'd like to do that is by changing the gate value over here. And the way that we're going to do that is very, very simple through an LFO. So I'm going to get an LFO over here. I like to drag this ahead as far as I can as well, so that it's nice and close to the parameter that we want to target. And we'll just set this to random, set the timing to 16 notes, so that for every 16 note that we generate, which is also what we're generating inside of the pattern over here, what we can do is just map this to the gate. And we need to make sure that this is set to like 50%, so it doesn't go up higher than you want it to go. I believe the way that you can check the high and the low point, especially if you're using this random parameter over here, is by doing something like this, where you just set the offset all the way up. We can see that we're at 100%, so let's turn it down a little bit. So we just go below 100%. We don't want it to go all the way and kind of connect to the next note that is going to play potentially. And in the lowest part, we don't want it to be on 1% because that's going to be too short. So maybe let's go for like 20% over here. That is sounding cool already. What I would like to do at this point is record in the MIDI so that we have it deterministically. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to target this one over here. I will just hit record on this MIDI track over here. It's always a little bit of a gamble doing this because you always want to make sure that the actual sequence that it plays when you're recording does sound nice. In this case, I do think that we got pretty lucky with all of that we got. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this in here, and now we can take all of these and just deactivate them. We no longer need them anymore because we have captured this essentially within this MIDI clip over here. And now it's always going to play back in the same way. As you can hear, it is completely deterministic now. Now, as I said, the last thing that we can take a look at is some of the glitchiness that you occasionally hear on these kind of sounds. So let's do that with my favorite glitch plugin, Deep Blue Glitch over here. I'm just kind of going to select a random seed over here. And what I'll do is I'll turn the mix all the way down so that we can accentuate the different parts here. Let's do maybe like this part over here. And actually, it is after the delay and reverb, which is kind of what I want, because if there's the delay tail that kind of slides into here, I want that delay tail to also be glitched up in a way. Let's try a different seed here until we find something that we like. So I landed on this variation over here. It does sound very nice like that. It just has a little bit of a stutter there. Maybe we'll try it here as well, just to see what that sounds like. Here we have a little bit of a click happening. So we probably want the mix to come in a little bit later. Just hold Alt and just shift it backwards like that. Maybe a bit more. What we can also do is just remove the notes that's causing the click over here. I like that. It's a little bit more of a gritty texture towards the end there. What you can of course also do if you have a particular kind of glitch in mind is just draw it in here. I just like to work with the randomness because this is deterministic and that it's always going to play back in kind of the same way. Some of the random parameters that the effects themselves uses are not deterministic in that they're not based on the seed, but the way that the effects are going to be played, the order of the effects that are going to be played here is completely determined by the seed over here. Of course, if you want more information on how this particular glitch plugin works, make sure that you check out the recent video that I did on it. So for now, this is what we have. So you can see in terms of the process of coming up with this sound, what I did was I identified all of the characteristics that I liked in like some reference sounds that I heard. I then linked those characteristics to certain sound design effects and techniques that I know from just the years of experience that I have sound designing different sounds. And then just step by step, I decided to implement all of those ideas. Now, I've said many times on my channel before that usually I don't like to work this way. Like, I'm not the kind of person that identifies a reference sound, makes it from scratch, and then just uses that in a track. The way that I like to do it is I just experiment and see what I can come up with. And through all of that experimentation is actually how I learn different things. But sometimes you already have a sound in mind, or you have just heard something that you want to emulate, then this is the way that you would go about that. You would identify all of the characteristics of the sound, see if you know any sound design techniques that can implement those characteristics, and then implement them. Of course, as you could see from the footage, we did experiment a little bit more with it. We went back into the patch and made some edits to it to just make it sound better. As it's not going to be this linear thing where you just start out with the patch, then do all of the processing, then do all of the MIDI triggering, and you just go over everything once. You're of course allowed to go back and make changes to the sound, and even now I might make some more changes to the sound. And that's the cool thing about all of the things that we've done up until this point. It is all deterministic. So I don't have to resample this to make sure that the sound plays back in the exact same way every time. Now, sometimes this is actually not what you want to do. I've recently done a video as well on a lot of non-deterministic sound design and how you would use that in like a production project. In that case, what I would recommend is doing jam sessions where you make these very, very long files, like stuff like this. So what you essentially do then is you get deterministic sounds in that they're just audio files, so they're always going to be playing back in the same way. But you do that by generating so much random stuff that you certainly going to get some interesting sounds that you can actually use in a track. Now, as you can imagine, the kind of recipe that we've just created can be implemented in any synth that you want. So let's try to do it in Serum as well. We'll start off with our Serum patch over here. Just a basic saw wave, as you can hear. And we'll use a tones from the tones pack in this case. I already know the kind of tones that sit in the tones pack, and I know that both the 1 here have this kind of characteristic. You can hear that nice zappy kind of FM sound. And then if I go to the 5, you'll see that we get a similar looking waveform. And it also has a similar kind of sound to it. Now, in the short that I mentioned in the intro, this is actually the technique that I used. I just used the tones from the tones pack and then just added my bandpass filter over here. Move that around a little bit. You can give it a bit of detune if you want as well. Like this. Now we get that ultra wide kind of sound if we want another one. So what is happening here is we have 2 voices. One is playing in the left speaker, the other one is playing in the right speaker. So you're going to get a very stereo sound. If you want a little bit more mono compatibility, you can add another voice, which is going to then play in the center or in both speakers. And we can blend those in as we want. We can do a little bit of processing over here. In this case, one of the distortions that I like is the 0 square. You do have to be very careful with this because it's very strong on the lower parts. So you can hear what kind of very gritty sound that you get from that. Maybe this is a little bit too much still, so we'll go a little bit lower. just as an extra layer on top of it, we'll add a little bit of dimension expander as well, because I usually like that sound as well. And now what we could do is we could just take the arpeggio thing that we made before, drop it in front of the serum here, and then turn it back on. And we can do the same thing where we just play in the MIDI notes first of all, see where the sound is going to fit. Maybe in this case, it would be nice to already have it come in the fill over here. I'll have a little bit of it over here. Let's just have like a 1 beat clip over here and over here. Again, this is going to be like a 2-bar pattern, so I'm just going to duplicate that here, here, and here. Here I'm going to remove it so that we have some more space to listen to the glitch sound, and I'll just extend this bit over here. So that's a little bit longer and a little bit more interesting. So now we have a pattern that we can use. We'll duplicate that over. Again, we'll have to set up something for our MIDI controller, and I'll also go ahead and take this LFO here so that we can already set up the gating that we had set up before. Just remap it to this gate over here, and you can see it's working again. In here, we'll set up our macro over here. Make sure that we actually configure it. So you have to go here, then move it around. And then if you go back, it actually shows up over here. And now again, what we can do is use our MIDI map here. So MIDI map, we'll move this up and down. As you can see, we are now mapped here. And we can play it in again. That sounds nice. One of the things I forgot in the other one, which we can do, by the way, is go in here and you can simplify envelope. This just breaks up all of the points that you record into some easier points to edit with. So if you want to make edits to this, for example, it might be a little bit repetitive what we have over here. What we can do is maybe have it stay a little bit higher here so that there's a little bit less movement, but it just stays nice and sharp here. In this case, we might want to have it a little bit lower starting. And in this one, we might have it a little bit higher. You can just make it a little bit more the way that you want to, and it's a little bit easier to edit than having all of the individual points that we saw before. Now again, we can do our processing. The easiest way to do this kind of processing, by the way, is just to take this from here to here and just duplicate it over. This is going to work because it's just going to be like the same kind of sound, and it's also playing in the same space. Maybe I do need to make some edits, maybe some changes to it. The one thing that I want to do is have the glitch play over here. We may need to find a new seed for it. Let's see if this actually works or not. It doesn't. Again, it would be useful to have all of the MIDI deterministic, so I'm going to record it again. We'll set this again to over here. We'll just record it like this. There's a few things that I would like to edit here. We have a few parts where it's just playing one note. So I'd like to maybe copy over some of the interesting parts, maybe like this bit over here. And we'll just move that to this part over here. And then maybe remove this note here. There was another part where it's just one note playing here. In this case, we'll edit it as well a little bit and maybe make it look like this. Here, what I would like to have is I would like to have it starting on the note all the time. So we're just going to do it like that. We're going to take these, maybe fill it up a little bit more, just make it overall a little bit more interesting here so that this space is nice and full. And now we can just drag this onto here like we did with the other one. And we'll turn off these 3 effects because we no longer need them and we don't want them to interfere with the idea that we now have. I do want to add a little bit more movement to this sound, particularly in the fill over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to filter it in a little bit more over time. And towards the end here, what I'll do is I'll have a nice sharp high pass here. Now granted, both of the synth sounds that we have used here rely on you having some of my files, some of my products. I don't want that to be the only part of this video, so I'll do one more, which is not going to use any of my products. Of course, as you can see, my products do help you create cool sounds like this. And they're a great way to support what I do here on YouTube as well. So if you're interested in that, make sure to check them out on my Gumroad page. For now though, let's go into this final one over here, and I'll use Vital in this case, just to show you that really any synth can do this kind of sound. What we'll do is we'll just use all 3 of the oscillators over here. I'm just going to open up the basic shapes on these 2 here. Just going to try to get like a nice sound out of a 3 FM setup. So FM from oscillator 2, FM from oscillator 3. We have this oscillator FMing this one, and this oscillator FMing this one. And we can just see if we can find a tone that we like. Let's turn down all of the phase randomization. Let's maybe try out a nice sync here. We can turn these down as well. Maybe something like that. A little bit more of a atonal kind of vibe I'm getting from this. Let's try a 24 dB per octave filter though. Again, I'll use 3 voices of unison just so that we have 1 in the mono and then 2 in the stereo fields. And then we get something like that. We'll assign our macro here for the filter. And in this case, what I'll do is I'll use it a little bit differently. I'll use it in this other part over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a few longer notes throughout a 4-bar clip here. Maybe something like this. I'm not going to cut it up this time. Maybe here. And I'm just kind of randomly placing them. We'll duplicate that over so that there's a little bit of a pattern to it. And then I'll just remove it out of the fill here. And what you can also do, what we saw before, is that we use our MIDI controller, but of course you can also just draw in the kind of shape that you want for each one of them. It is actually fairly quick if you just do it like this, and then holding Alt, you can of course bend the different automations as well, so that you get a nice curvature to it. Maybe you want a few that can do like this double movements that go up and down. Let's do that over here as well, just so that it's a little bit more interesting towards the start. And here we'll go down and up. Maybe this is going to be a bit too aggressive, but we'll hear that later. What we can do is set the modulation amount a little bit higher so that the movement is a little bit more exaggerated. Those first 2 sound a little bit too much alike, in my opinion. I'd like them to be maybe still a little bit lower as well. Still too much the same. Maybe I'll have this one go up instead. course, in this case, what we can do again is just copy over the processing here. So we'll take this and dial this in over here. For this one, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the glitch and just up it all the way, all the time, so that it's always just glitching it up. We do have a little bit of a problem. As you can hear, it still plays over here in the fill, and I don't want that. An easy way to fix that is just using a utility. We'll just take a utility minus infinity and then just turn that on in the fill so we make sure that it doesn't play there. Maybe it's still a little bit too loud in comparison to those other synths, but that's basically it. So as you can probably tell, overall the sound design is pretty easy and you can just implement it in whatever synth that you want. As long as you know the characteristics of the sound that you're trying to create and you know how to implement those characteristics, which is something that you can learn just through experimentation in sound design, then you can basically use this method to basically cook up a recipe for any sound that you're after. And really, you can just use this method whenever you exactly know what kind of sound that you're looking for. Now, of course, there needs to be a huge disclaimer here in that you cannot just learn the kind of sound design that we're doing here in like a day or something like that. This is a few years of experience of sound design, knowing kind of how to make these kind of sounds as well, having experimented with these kind of sounds before. But in the grand scheme of things, this is not something that is hard to learn because all that you're really doing is just having fun and experimenting with sounds. And the only thing that you need to do to actually learn how to take that approach of finding characteristics and then implementing them is to kind of note down either mentally or actually in like maybe a notebook or something like that, what the different processes that you're using when experimenting actually do to the sound. So just to run through that, for example, we know that an FM setup is probably going to generate a gritty kind of sound because that is what FM is really good at, especially when you're using 3 oscillators over here because you can get some really nice complex FM tones from that. And we know that we can add movement to a sound like this by adding a 24 dB per octave filter. Specifically in this case, I'm going for a bandpass filter because that cuts out the most amount of sound and therefore when it moves around it has the most drastic effect. But you can also go for a high pass filter with a little bit more resonance if you want a little bit of a different characteristic as well. So really what I'm trying to get at with this video is that learning how to sound design is very, very similar to learning how to cook. In that there's a few approaches, but it all boils down to this kind of cycle of finding a particular part of a process that you can just tie to a specific characteristic. For example, you can say that salt just enhances flavor. Once you know that adding salt to a particular dish will enhance the flavor of that dish. And once you've worked enough with salt in your dishes, you'll probably get like an idea of what the dish is going to taste like when you add salt to it before even trying. Now, as I said before, experimentation can help a lot, but another thing that can help a lot is following a recipe, or in this case, a tutorial. There is a small issue with that approach though, and that is an issue that I personally have with my cooking as well. I know a bunch of recipes, but I don't tend to experiment too much with the recipes that I know. I just cook the few things that I know and I enjoy what I cook, but I tend not to improve my cooking because I never really experiment here. And you're going to have the same kind of issues if you never really experiment with your sound design. So hopefully this video inspired you to experiment a little bit more and just see where you can get with a little bit of sound design while noting down what all of the different processes that you're implementing are actually doing so that you can actually learn from that. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to support the channel, a good way to do that is by watching more of my content. So there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now, which YouTube will think that you'll enjoy. So just choose one and keep on watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.